Well, I mean, everything still looks fine, but also everything 100% looked fine before, and so I have no idea. We'll see. We'll see how long we can make it. If we can't get things working out, we'll circle back around for some more conversations. I know that Michael's been keeping up conversation in the chat, but Michael, if you want to answer any of those questions out loud now, you theoretically can, because we are back live again.
We just have one for Valerie North who says, was there anything in the design where you tried it and it didn't quite work the first time? And I think that was definitely the case with the cards. Like it was, there was, so for example, there's a mechanic in which, and one of the really interesting things, and one that, everything's going wrong today. One of the really interesting things about those moments where you're deciding whether or not to stick and try and win, or to fold and pull out of a challenge. So obviously in a deck of cards, you've got your face cards. So you've got your jacks, your queens, and your kings. And those are the characters that you're playing as, right? So, someone will be the jack of spades, or someone will be the king of hearts, or the queen of clubs. So those are characters in the game, and whilst they're just characters in the game, narratively, like mechanically, they're also like existing in the deck. So if you draw the king of clubs, and that is one of the characters that's playing around the table, suddenly they get themselves in a very, very difficult position. Because if you are, for example, looking for spades and you accidentally pull a picture card from a different suit, so you're looking for spades, you pull that king of clubs. If you fail, when you fail, you lose all of the cards in your run, right? So what happens to that character if you've just lost that card in the deck? So in the original iteration, essentially your character dies, right? It was super like, whoa, okay. and whilst that was very, very fun, and it was like incredibly harsh, like it felt too harsh at that point. So we introduced a damage system. So you might have seen it on the character sheet there. Basically, there's a small diamond next to every one of the suits, which is your modifiers. So, for example, if you're trying to draw 2 hearts and you have a modifier of -1, you only need to draw 1 heart. But if you damage a stat, it permanently increases your modifier by +1. So you essentially, every time that happens, every time you fail a challenge and one of those cards gets taken out of the deck, you can put it back in exchange for your character being permanently scarred by the events. And those can have like a really interesting sort of like narrative implication as well. So, what does it mean if a character who wasn't actually attempting something ends up getting hurt by the action you were taking? And also, they're not just physical damage. Like it could be your mental state, it could be your morale, it could be like your willingness to push through. It could be any one of those sort of aspects of you as a person that's been damaged. So it's very much like a system that is open to all avenues. So you can play this completely non-lethally. You can play this in like non-human forms. Like it doesn't just have to be, oh, you're damaged, so you broke your leg. It's like you're damaged, and suddenly you've been troubled with a past memory that you just can't shake, and it keeps like messing with your head every time that you're trying to make like an important decision, or suddenly you just don't trust the rest of your group anymore. So suddenly your morale is just shaken a little bit. And it's very much not a case of pick from one of these lists. It's just you fill in a box, you choose the stat that goes next to, and you decide what that means for you. And it's a system that I think works really, really well. And it was definitely something that was not necessarily perfect in the first iteration. So I hope that's a good example, Valerie.
Yeah, I also meant to comment earlier that one of the most interesting things about the game to me was it is like some people might say it's like, generic, which is to a certain degree true, but it feels like it has a theme with no genre, which is a really interesting take. Like lots of times people will overlap those two, that genre is theme, right? And so it is very cool because I do feel like there is a type of story you're absolutely trying to tell every single time. Like the theme is overthrowing the forces of power in the world. What genre, time, location, and flavor you choose to play that in is completely different, and the flexibility of a system like that is incredibly interesting and kind of pushes back on something being generic means that there's no teeth or edge or ability to push something forward within that, which I just think it's such a smart piece of design on your part. I don't want us to lose the conversation we were just trying to have also too. So if you're watching this later, you might have noticed a blip a couple minutes ago. We both restarted the stream, and then I had to restart my computer and restart the stream at one point.
It's been a whole thing.
but we were talking specifically about inclusivity in games. It's a conversation I'm 100% not willing to let two white guys with beards on stream let pass without more comment. Let's try to do the recap. You approached Adira about collaborating. Adira said, I really like there to be more diversity in this. And the end product is a lot of diverse designers and collaborators, and incredibly good representation within the art itself also too. So it's both like somebody looking at this couldn't question whether that was important to you. And if they dove into who the collaborators were, they would see that also. So you said you were really hesitant kind of reaching out to people because you were new. You felt like you hadn't kind of punched at this weight before. Tell me a little bit more about that process and some of the choices you made in that line.
Yeah, so like I was very much like when I was first sort of like toying with the idea of doing a Kickstarter, right? It was just very much a case of, oh, it's my first time. Like I don't want to push it too hard. Like I don't want to be too ambitious. So it started off as just like I'll just ask people that I'm already friends with if they want to collaborate, right? So it was Zoe, it was Johnny, it was Spencer. Like it was people that, you know, are incredibly important to me and I wanted to have on the project. Like they're wonderful people, but like obviously when you just give yourself such a small area of like talent pool, obviously it's not going to be the most diverse thing in the world, especially in like the games industry, which, you know, is where these people come from, and it's something that we need to fix as a whole. So it was very much a case of, you know, when I was trying to look for that diversity, it was very much outside of my comfort zone, and I think just having that conversation with Adira like early on, and I'm glad it happened so soon, you know, of just like having that question of like, well, why aren't you reaching out to these people? Like, and just, you know, almost like a therapy session, just sitting me down and go like, right, can we just explore what's going on in your head? Because it was very much just an anxiety thing, right? It's just a case of like, I'm worried that if I ask someone who I respect, if they want to be on my project, then I might get turned down. And like, I think when you actually dissect that and just look at it, like, what's the worst that could happen? Like, if someone's just like, sorry, I'm not, you know, I'm not interested, or I'm busy, or whatever, it's not the end of the world. Like, for example, I reached out to, I won't name drop anyone that didn't come on the project, but like I reached out to someone who I really respected. They didn't have the time, and then like that was it. Like it's just that. And I think a lot of that was a mental health thing for me. But for a lot of you know, designers who are maybe just sort of starting out and want to see diversity but aren't necessarily sure how to do that, I think sometimes it can be difficult to just come to terms with the fact that it's like you just have to ask and try. Like there is just a case of, you know, if you don't ask you don't get, and it's even more important in this case, right? So
yeah, and I'll hear lots of reasons for not doing that, like, you know, and I think that internal one is one that doesn't come up so often, so I think it's really valuable for people to hear. Lots of the ones are like, well, I don't want to be engaging in tokenism, and I'm like, well, I don't want you to use that as an excuse to not actually invite people. Like, if you're actually inviting people because you want diversity and because you want to collaborate and because they're good at what they do, that's fine. Like, it's not about saying like I have to have, you know, the black person or the trans person or whatever person you feel like is an important person to have on your team. It's about saying I want excellent designers, and there are a ton of excellent diverse designers out there, and I'm going to go approach them. But yeah, that how do I drop a Twitter? How do I approach that? Like, you know, especially if you don't know how pay or funding or any of that stuff is going to work out, can be
that was another
big
thing
question.
Like,
you know,
it was like, you know, what do I even pay people? Like, it was very much like, this is the first time I've ever tried this, so I was very much just like, and once again, you know, just asking Adira like, what's the standard rate that you would normally charge, like all this kind of thing. And I think I think we talked about, I think it was around like 10 cents a word was kind of like a kind of
industry standard.
So I think in the end, because the Kickstarter did really well, and like they're quite short scenarios, I think I bumped that up to 20 because I just like, I wanted to make sure that it was like, this is the other thing. It's like, yeah, sure, you can try and scrimp and save and pay people not very much, but like I want these people to enjoy working with me and like to want to come back and stuff like that. So it was that was another thing for me, just like making sure that, you know, grabbing a really diverse pool of people to tell different stories, because like at the end of the day, like, you know, you spoke about people trying to avoid tokenism and stuff. Is if you are so scared of hiring someone like of a different ethnic background than you, for example, like in the vein of like, I don't want it to appear tokenistic. It's like, well, it's only going to appear tokenistic if you hire exactly one person who isn't white and then just like pay them very little and then shove them off, because obviously that's awful. But if you're just like getting a large breadth of people and paying them properly for their work, and you're genuinely interested in the stories that they want to tell, rather than just like, okay, yeah, like you said, here's the X person that I'm going to grab, then, you know, I really don't think many people are going to see it like that. And if they do, then that's, you know, it's a conversation you can have with them.
The only time people see things like that is if you have a track record of doing that. Like, you know, like that's really where it comes up. Even the first time, like most people are not, people want to see, it's not about seeing representation. It's about seeing people like me and seeing bigger stories than just come out of one experience and one background. And that's like, regardless of the community I'm talking to, whether it's the games community, whether it's other groups that I work with on a regular basis, like the more voices we pull into a project, the more diverse voices, the different voices, people who have different lived experiences and different existential realities, like the more better stories we get a chance to tell. And that's everything that getting, like sitting around a table and role playing, that's everything it's about. And extending that to the design process is an absolutely essential thing. Yeah, like Electra says, it makes the stories richer. Like that is what we are going for. We're not going for anything else beyond that.
Let me give you a great example that's completely like detracted out of like conversations that some people might find like uncomfortable about race and sexuality and all those kind of things. Like, so I happen to be wearing a t-shirt today. Like I used to work on Total War, which is like a video game series, right? And there was very much a culture of like, they kept hiring Total War fans. And that meant that every time they put out a new game, it was even more Total War than the last one, right? And it ended up being the one that I enjoyed the most, the one that I'm wearing the t-shirt of, that I'm really proud of working on, was Three Kingdoms, because it's a whole new breadth of people from a different background who had never heard of Total War and working on it now. And it's like, if you keep hiring the same people to work on things, they all have the same experiences and the same backgrounds, like nothing's going to change, and everyone's going to get really, really bored of all the things that are happening. And that's why like we keep seeing very, very similar projects from like certain areas of different industries just like feeling the same from one another. Whereas when you look at spaces like itch.io, where people can just make games wherever they want, they feel so like different from each other, and so like, whoa, I've never even thought about this. Well, this is such an interesting thing. It's like, well, yeah, it's like, it's not the same for white guys writing the same games that you've been playing since you were 15, right? That's why it's interesting, because you're getting people from different backgrounds, different experiences to make these things. And that was something that was important to me. And it was very much like I was passionate about the, like you said, it's an agnostic theme, right? It's a theme of revolution. House Always Win, and I don't think I would have been comfortable saying that I was the correct voice to be the only voice on that project. So like, I wanted to make sure that there was people from all over.
Wait, a white British male isn't the best voice.
Exactly, right?
No, I love that. Like I said, I didn't want us to gloss past that, or to not come back to that, because I do think it's an incredible part. And I think the way the project ended up incarnating that in every aspect of what it is absolutely gorgeous. And so like Adira is always so good, both in professional conversations like that, but also I know like there have been times even in my review work where I've been like, I don't know how I'm supposed to approach this. And when I ask in a couple communities we're a part of, Adira's always been incredibly helpful in giving insight into how to navigate those. 95% of the time, it's just like, just reach out to the person and enter into a relationship and be real and be present to them. And the other thing is, especially if you're somebody who might represent a certain institutional mindset, realize it might take you time to build trust. People might not, it might not even be time. It might be like, yeah, like, I mean, people might even for Wheels' project said like, I don't know you. And it's not that you're new that's the problem. It's I don't know if I can trust working on your project because you don't have a track record showing me that it's safe. And that's a real thing that anybody who looks like the two of us should take into account. And it's not a judgment on you. It's a statement of continually do good, and people will eventually notice that record and notice that you're doing the work, and that you're actually championing this and not just doing it for marketing or because you feel like you have to, but because you absolutely desire those richer games and those greater experiences that community, that all of us as human beings bring into that experience, but that a number of people have been excluded from historically. So
you absolutely can't take that kind of thing personally as well. Like, people have to keep themselves safe at the end of the day. Like, I mean, you look at the whole perfect RPG thing that happened recently, where like without even knowing it, people were collaborating with someone that they absolutely did not want to have anything to do with, because they were kind of taken for a ride without realizing. And I don't personally buy many of the apologies that went out based on that, but like, even if you believe that whole idea of, oh well, I just didn't realize, it's still, this is the reason why people aren't going to jump at certain opportunities, because they have to prepare themselves, and they have to be wary of the kind of like deals that they're getting into, right?
Yeah, and you have to think it out to the nth degree. Like, I made a list for Troika Fest, I made a list of D66 like backgrounds. No actual skills that go into Troika, just a list of people you might meet at Troika Fest, right? And I still popped it into a couple groups to say, would everybody just look at this and just tell me if there's anything problematic you see in there, or anything that you think would be upsetting, like anything that would be like that would make you feel unwelcome, or because that's not the point. The point is the whimsy and the bizarreness, but that can lead into certain choices, and that's a very small thing. And I still wasn't just like, oh, we're just going to pop it out and it doesn't matter, right? It's still like, I'm going to put it to the community first in safe places and trustworthy spaces where there's a lot of people who can give me the feedback if they want to tell me if this dumb little list of 66 like character concepts I've made up has anything that's a problem on it, right? Because at no point do I want somebody to feel like they can't show up because of this dumb little word that I put on this image that's going to go on social media, making them feel like that's not a space for them. And so like doing the work, like being conscious, thinking through those things ahead of time. For me, from the very beginning of that entire debacle, the concept of somebody in a position of being a VP at a company that 1/3 of their revenue is games, putting out a game called Perfect RPG seemed incredibly tone deaf from the launch, especially when it's a lot of small creators who are nervous. And I know it was supposed to be tongue in cheek, but I think like that doesn't necessarily fly in the room that you're in, where people are already super nervous about the content they're putting out and you're an accomplished creator. I think there's a ton of things that were huge issues with that project, even if some of the other pieces hadn't happened. I mean, like I said, it's, thank goodness we don't have to talk that much anymore. And, as everything has worked out largely well, I would say, in that situation. And people are now more aware of things they should be aware of in that situation. And by which I mostly mean the consuming audience and not anybody institutionally. And so, awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about Dicebreaker and your work there. For people who aren't familiar with Dicebreaker, give us the elevator pitch for Dicebreaker. Because I do want to talk a little bit about somebody, my friend Jess Stormer recently was like, well, was referring to he and I are like, we're members essentially of the RPG press. And it was such an interesting thing to think about. People who do content, commentary, other things around RPG, me, you, Jeff, any other number of people are essentially a press corps for a certain type of industry. And Dicebreaker just does a ton of content for all types of gaming. So tell us a little bit about Dicebreaker and what it is.
Yeah, so Dicebreaker is, it was a site that was built by, it was a company that was originally called Gamer Network, but are now sort of part of a larger company called Repop. So you might know them because they run events like PAX and MCM and all that kind of thing. But in our wing, we're sort of like the digital kind of like journalistic sort of brand area, right? So we've got things like Eurogamer and VG247 and Outside Xbox and that kind of thing. But Dicebreaker is the newest project in that wing. It is obviously tabletop focused. And the whole idea that we're trying to push for Dicebreaker, and tell us if we're not, because we want to fix it, is if you turn up to a Dicebreaker video or like a Dicebreaker article or something like that, and you don't know what is going on in the tabletop space, you're like, you've maybe like played a game of Risk and you're like, what, board games are big? Like that's kind of like where you should be, right? It is a place where someone who's completely new to all of this can feel comfortable and safe and welcome. So we're very much, whilst we have a team of, what I'm comfortable in calling experts, like Matt Jarvis, for example, our editor-in-chief, is one of the most knowledgeable people I've ever seen in board games. Like I will like talk about something that I've literally never heard of. He's like, oh yeah, no, I remember reviewing that. And I'm like, where have you found all the time to play these games, Matt? Like, but he's also just like a thoroughly lovely man and is like always thinking about how to make our site more welcoming and more inclusive and all of those kind of things. It's your standard sort of like journalistic website, so you can expect articles, you can expect lists, you can expect guides, all that kind of thing, like you would from something in the video game space. But as far as we're aware, we're kind of one of the first projects of this scale in the space, which is kind of what makes it interesting, right? Because it's like, I think like the press sort of core, like you said, of like TTRPGs and board games, card games, it's always been a bit of a cottage industry up until now. But now that, as with everything, people have seen that it's profitable. So now that, you know, big companies are coming in to try and like assert themselves. And I think, like, I feel quite privileged to be on a team that have that opportunity. And it's very much a team full of people who want to be a force for good and to want to make that a really welcoming space, and to hopefully like cut down a few of those like really gatekeepery aspects of the hobby. And that's kind of where we stand. Like that's what we're all about.
Yeah, no, we were talking before we went live. Also, like, I sent out my first press release ever, which wasn't even about my stuff. I should probably be doing that when I make things and run Kickstarters and other stuff like that. But it was about Troika Fest, and you know, and really, I put it out to everybody on the list that I had, because there are different ways I wanted to invite people to participate in it. It was basically just like, hey, just so you're aware that this is happening, if you want to tag in, because it's a decentralized event. Like, I'm hosting content for it. Melsonian is supporting it. Like, we're essentially sponsoring it. But the whole goal of Troika Fest is play Troika or do something with Troika this week, wherever you're at in the world, however you want to do it. Like, that's great. Like, if you share it online, we'll amplify that and be excited about it. And that's wonderful. But the whole goal is to say, let's give everything over to a community and try to create like just an invitation for people. So like, I included you on it knowing that like, hey, y'all are probably booked for your video content for next week. But if you have something Troika related that you wanted to re-put out or just share during that part, that there's an invitation to just say like, even if you've already done something, how do we share what this is? Or if you Wheels want to jump in on the Troika Fest jam, like that you as an influential member of the community would know it was happening and everything else. When you were kind of coming, like you talked a little bit about this, it's a cottage industry. And I feel like in the board game space, like people kind of expect it now. Like if a successful Kickstarter in the board game space is going to have, 2 or 3 reviews by other people that say, here's the game, I played it, here's the prototype copy that I have, and they're going to do some actual plays or review work. People are going to drop that on their site, and it's going to be edited and well presented in a way that they've brought their audience to that game, and that they've brought the game's audience to that channel also too. In RPGs, that is still very uncommon outside of, we're going to drop a 4-hour actual play that we did one of, and we'll put that basically on our site as proof of concept. Like, someone played this game once, I guarantee. But there's not as much other content out there. Have you like, I just kind of want to throw that out. Like, I don't have a specific set of questions here, but I would be interested in like, as in your position at Dicebreaker, what are some of the ways y'all are trying to engage specifically the RPG community a little bit more in understanding like how content can be helpful besides just notoriety?
Yeah. So I think, one thing that's really important with like Dicebreaker as like a I don't want to say as a brand, because it makes me want to punch myself in the face, but like what's really important with Dicebreaker is that like as a member of this kind of like wing of like quite I don't mind saying like prestigious websites, like Eurogamer is a big deal, especially in the UK and things like that. We have like a level of journalistic integrity that we really have to stick to. Like there are like for example, like the reason that we're talking about Dicebreaker to begin with is because we have like a sort of like strict thing of if I go on a podcast and I'm Wheels, right, that we do have to kind of like make that barrier clear of like, I am not a journalist from Dicebreaker reviewing my own game and saying it's good. Like, I'm Wheels, who made this game, and then like this is completely like diverse from Dicebreaker as a whole. But it's also that
good thing the video stream split in half. It'll create a good delineation point for that.
But yeah, it's like, it's very much like that case of like we have some pretty rigorous sort of like standards that we adhere to, and it's you will even have the case of like, we have a member of the team, Lolies, who used to work for Big Potato, who are a tabletop games publisher. She did sales for them. She's not like she wasn't like a designer. She didn't make any of the games. She was just sort of like doing work for that company. Now, whenever we play like a Big Potato game on the stream, we'll make that very clear. Like we want to give people the information up front. I think that's something that's really important to establish in both industries, especially like tabletop and RPGs. And I don't want to sort of like, not like, I don't want to like cast shade at like smaller creators, but there is like a level of, you know, if you're like a YouTube reviewer, you're only sort of beholden to your own standards as a person.
Yeah, I mean
and
that's me. I'm only beholden to my own standards as a person. Like it's a true statement.
Yeah, it's like, you know, and it's like it's easier to sort of slip and be like, oh well, you know, like this is a mate, but maybe I won't mention it because, you know, it's not worth it or something like that. Whereas, you know, when you work for a company like that, that's something that you kind of have to adhere to. And it's like, because we've made that like a sort of strict code kind of thing at Dicebreaker, as you would expect from a journalistic like entity, like that's something that gives you a degree of trust, which means that you've got like a baseline, right? So that you can see like you can see like an article that's been shared by us and sort of compare it with other people and say, okay, all right, cool. So you give yourself sort of like a baseline of what's happening. Like we try and hold those standards up so that you could get more of a picture of what's really going on around this sort of space, which I think is really important.
I do too. Like, and we even talked, like, part of the reason it came up, and like I would have wanted to talk about it anyways. Like when you originally approached me, you said, "Hey, like I'd love to come on, like, you know, do an interview." And I was like, "Hey, here's what we normally do. We normally start with an actual play, and then we'll do a short interview at the end, and then, you know, I'll do a polished review." And, you know, you said, like, I have to check my I don't know if it's non-compete your contract though. You have like rules around how you can engage even in other people's streams, and all that stuff is designed to help say, like, we want clarity in what is coming from our channel, like what is not coming from our channel, what is Wheels, what is, you know, Dicebreaker, all those different pieces, which is, yeah, it sounds like a lot to navigate. And I like knowing that that's all part of journalistic integrity, I can absolutely respect, because I sit here lots of the time and I'm like, you know, I'll be very clear about my biases. Like if I review GURPS, it's incredibly biased because I love GURPS. It's the first game I played. It's the one that I spent the most time playing and have a lot of investment in, and launched me into RPGs. So my emotional attachment to it is very high. Like, you know, and whether people like GURPS or not, that's fine. Like, that's okay. You're wrong. I'm just kidding. It's fine. But there's a bias there. Or if someone's a friend, I'm going to be excited about their game. Now, and I'm also very clear, like I do enthusiastic reviews. Like I'm not interested in critiquing or dumping on someone's game in a review. I'd rather just tell that person, hey, I shouldn't review your game. Like I'm going to tell you how to make a character, like what mechanics are like, what I liked about it. And then I'm going to tell you what type of person might like it. And if you're that person, you should go check it out. And that means I'm never going to hit like, oh, well, I wish they would have done this, or they, you know, they didn't really do this, but, you know, like, I'm just not going to do that. If I'm in a conversation with somebody like this, I might ask questions like, hey, Wheels, why did you choose this instead of that? Or I didn't really get this mechanic. Could you explain it better? You know, I'll ask critical questions and I'm happy to do that, but my reviews are all enthusiastic. Right. And so, like, because I'd just rather not review something that I can't be enthusiastic about. But not everybody has that kind of approach or other things like that. And so it's really helpful to kind of know how other people are operating. What are some ways that you think people right now could be making use, not maybe just of Dicebreaker, though I think that's good insight. Like somebody's got an upcoming Kickstarter, a big RPG they're excited about. How do they get on the radar for Dicebreaker? How do they engage in Dicebreaker well? Or what are things you think people maybe should be doing more broadly as they're approaching reviewers and content creators and outlets?
Yeah, I think like the biggest problem with most of these things is that a lot of these projects are sort of like done by like 1, 2, 3 people teams, and like it's fair enough to say that, you know, you're not all PR specialists. Like I'm not. Like I have only ever been on the other end of it. Right, I've only ever received the press release rather than send one out. Even when I was working in video game production, like I was never on the PR side. I was just sort of doing content creation as well. So like it is like a tricky thing to like, how do I contact these people? What do I say? Like what makes this interesting? But I will say that like we have just a email, it's contact@dicebreaker.com. like just get in touch. Like we've had so many like little indie projects that have just reached out and been like, hey, I don't expect you to want anything from this, but like, can you have a look at our game? And like, we'll absolutely take a look at it. Like we can't guarantee that anything will get made from it because obviously there's only so many hours in the day. But like we'll absolutely take a look at it. It might get mentioned on the podcast, like anything like that. And I think just, you know, just to bring it back to what we were talking about with reaching out to other designers before, it's like it's the same thing of just being, if you don't ask, you don't get. Like you have to put yourself out there and just like believe in the thing that you're making. It's always that case of, you know, I think Kickstarter have it as like one of their FAQs, or maybe it was like an FAQ from somebody else about Kickstarter that I was reading when I was first reading into it. It's like, if you can't like convince, your friends, for example, to back your Kickstarter? Like, why is that? Like, what are you struggling with about selling your product? And is that maybe something you want to address before you start putting it in the public eye? So I think there's two questions to ask yourself. If you love something and you can wax lyrical about it and you think you've done a really good job, like, why aren't you just telling people that? And why aren't you just hoping that they do something with it? It's going to take some time, but you could just email 100 different content creators you like, and at least a few of them will probably be interested, right? But if you ask yourself that question, you're like, well, actually, I'm not sure how to talk about it, or like what to say about it, or why it's good. Like, investigate that. Like, what is it about your project that you're not passionate about, and maybe change it. Like, give yourself some time to sit down and think, not just, is this the game that I want to make, but is this a game that other people want to play, and like, why is that? Because that's just going to be as useful for a designer as it is for a press outlet. Like, what is it that sells people on your game? What's the elevator pitch?
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly like helpful. And like I said, I think it's something people need to think more and more about. Like, we don't see board games funding a ton because they don't do this. And it is one of those lessons that people, I think, can take from the board game industry. Like, if you go look at what board games are doing well and why they're like, the price points aren't that different. As a matter of fact, they actually have smaller margins typically than, like, which I know sounds insane as an indie creator, but the reality is, like, I can produce a run of 200 copies of my game, if it's a zine, for anywhere between $2 and $4 a copy, right? Yeah. If they've got to produce a minimum of 500 and are still going to be more expensive than that, and if they want to run off like less than that, it's going to be $30 to $80 a copy to get their prototyping done. Like, the ability to, on a small scale, produce an RPG gives us way more margin to play with. And so, like, there's a lot we could be doing and could be learning from that space. Speaking of which, I want to give people just a chance. If you haven't gone to check out the Dice Always Win, what's the best place for people to go if they're like, I want to get a copy of this, I don't have a copy of this, I didn't back the Kickstarter? What's the best place for them to go stay in the loop about that?
Yeah, so we're very, very close to the digital release. Obviously, the printing will take a lot longer than that. I'm not entirely sure still what the case is going to be with printed copies after the Kickstarter itself. So, like, if you want to grab a physical edition, what that's going to look like. But if you just want to grab a PDF, wheelsrpgs.com/THDAW is like the landing page. So the house doesn't always win, THDAW.
And you can you have a hackable, you have a third party license, so people want to hack the game also too. They can do that. Some members of the house is also on that same website. They can go check that out too, because I know we have.
There's also, you can grab character sheets from there. You can grab just sort of like links to the actual play that we did for the Kickstarter page and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's all there, everything you need. I will say, like, members of the house as well. Like, that's something that it was very much something that I wasn't really thinking about, but it kind of makes sense from such a like setting agnostic system. Like, it's it's a set of tools for people to use. So if you're interested by the things that I've been talking about and you want to make a game based on those, like, I have like a contact page at the bottom of that page, of the members of the house page, that is just like, if you're from a marginalized background, or you just can't afford to buy a game every time you want to make something, just give me an email. I'll send you a free copy, because like I'm more interested in seeing what people do with it than I am like making 20 quid or whatever it is on the book, right? But you can grab a pre-order copy from that. That will basically just give you an email when the thing is live, and you'll get it from there. It's 25 British pounds. I don't know what that is in dollars, but there you go.
I think it's like 30, 32, something like that right now. Yeah. And so, no, awesome. So but what I wanted to talk about a little bit more is we talk about learning lessons from the RPG space, something we don't normally do here, because you said you have a little bit more time than the average person that we interview sometimes. I want to talk about something that we have been talking about that came up in your conversation with Jeremy, that I also think a lot of the design that you do, I think, absolutely captures what I would classify as a kind of classic parlor game feel. Like, your Wizards game, as well as the House Doesn't Always Win, is I think has some really great elements that make it feel more like a parlor storytelling game than like a RPG where we're going to roll dice and sit around and chunk things, mainly because they are different, right? And so one of the things that came up in that conversation that you had with Jeremy, and he was like, I've talked with a couple other people about this in the last weeks, is this kind of how we take things from board games and RPGs and start to kind of blend them and mesh them together. Part of my thing that I've been looking at is that conversation is creating a scale, right? Creating a scale of games that essentially are like, hey, on a scale of, if 0 is chess, checkers, abstract, no theme, no role playing, like, because you're usually not like, I'm the red knight and here's what, or I'm the red king and here's what it means to be the red king, or I'm the white king and here's what right queen, or I'm the black queen and here's what that means. Like, none of that happens when you play chess typically. Now you can be welcome to play chess that way. I absolutely invite you to. On the other end, you have free-form storytelling, which is not even really a game at that point in time, but can certainly be gamified. That might be like a theoretical 11. I want to sit down with you. I've got the Google Doc up next to us, so as we talk through, we can do it. If you're watching in chat right now and want to hop in on this, we're going to talk a little bit about what is the scale of games from like one being, yes, this has a theme, but it's definitely a board game, to 10 being like, this is mostly storytelling, but yes, it has some rules and it's still a game. Like, what games would fall into that? What would help us delineate whether something's a 1 versus a 2 versus a 3? All kind of all the way up and down, based on games that we know and like and can talk about. And we don't both have to know the game, but we have to be able to talk about it with each other coherently enough. And then what are some of the signifiers that would let us know something's at that level? If you have ideas on this while you're watching, if you're out there watching right now, you're absolutely welcome to kick out what you think it is. But the concept is, if 0 is a full board game, and if 11 is just free-form storytelling, what is the 1 to 10 scale of board games up through RPGs? So we've got that up here. We're gonna chit chat and talk about it. But we kind of set up here like 0, 100% board game would be like chess, checkers, like anything kind of abstract, semi-warish. I would even say like more modernly and not as just Eurocentric. We have like Shobu. Is like this Go historically is kind of on that same realm. There's not a narrative process in any way, shape, or form. I would
abstract, right? Is the go-to term, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
it's that kind of thing of, it is very much like that. It is just a game. Like, there's no story whatsoever. There's nothing to read into.
And I would say full storytelling is kids playing in the backyard. Or any form of collaborative, non-mechanic storytelling, right?
Like fireside stories, like that kind of thing, right?
You're right. And yeah, like, tell me what you do next, right? Or like, and then, like, did you guys play and then as a kid, where like you basically are sitting in a circle, and whenever somebody says and then, it passes to the next person to tell the story, and you basically are just telling a story from beginning to the end, but whenever somebody says and then, the next person picks up.
I was gonna think that like 10 could be like improv comedy, like 10 is that yes and, right? It's like it's kind of like the system that a lot of RPGs are sort of it's the unwritten rule of that kind of yes and thing of like, okay, now you go. I think as you get sort of like slightly further down the scale, you'll get into those kind of like storytelling, maybe journaling RPGs, but also I think you'll probably start hitting the mechanics. As so Electricia said, 1,000-Year-Old Vampire, which is a fantastic game. It's a really, really lovely journaling game. But it has, one of the things that we said about it when we were talking about it on the podcast, like it's just got that little bit more mechanic than you expect from that kind of journaling game. I think that would probably sit around like an 8, like that kind of area.
Oh, you think 1,000-Year-Old Vampire would be like an 8?
Yes, because it's got like, Rosie, what are you? The other cat's getting involved now. Come on. It's got like resources. It's got like stat blocks. It's got dice rolling. Like it's starting to verge into the territory of like a sort of more RPG.
In the same kind of vein, I think like Wretched and Alone, I feel like that lives in like the 6-5 realm, like like the whole Wretched system, because you've got the clear like Jenga and deck of cards, and those mechanics are absolutely driving when the game ends, how the game progresses, other things like that. But it is more narrative focused. So I think I would put something like the Wretched at as something that clearly has board game influenced mechanics, other things like that. But
you could probably put Jenga up, not Jenga, sorry, Dread up at number 9 with its Jenga tower, right? Where it is literally just like, it's a storytelling game. Pretty much there's no stats or anything like that, but when you try something, you pull that block from the Jenga tower, right? And I think that is like that is as soon as the like mechanical interaction starts coming out of RPGs. Like if you were to sort of move down the scale like that,
right,
as soon as you hit Dread, you're like, okay, right, we got some like mechanics that we can pass or fail with, kind of thing.
Right.
But it's still very, very abstract.
So there's a game that's not out yet, though I think it's solidly in the middle. And this is always what I'm looking for. Like, so Torque by Will Jobst, I think, is a solid 5 on this scale, which I don't know if you looked at, but it's actually, it's a 5 also because it's a good mix of It's like one half of the game is a map that you've got out, and it's Road Warrior with rules for your car, and you're shooting at each other, and then you're stopping at these rest stops in between, and it's just chill role playing while you're at the rest stop. So it actually doesn't achieve it by saying here's a perfect blend. It achieves it by saying here's two states of the game, one that's pretty full on RP and one that's pretty full on board game, but neither one is fully to one end or the other. And so it's one of the ones I'll always put out as a 5 on that system also too. Let's see if we've got any from the chat. If you've got any ideas on this, feel free, toss them in. And we were talking about this earlier, like Dungeons and Dragons. So where would you put? Let's go ahead and name it.
I think this is where we start getting to 4 is Dungeons and Dragons, because Dungeons and Dragons feels very much like, I mean, well, it was, right. It started as a miniatures game, and then eventually it became an RPG, and you can still see that DNA in all of the systems, how they work, all the measurements and the, like, you know, a 30 cube around you, all that kind of thing. Like, I feel like that is the most, because it's not, I wouldn't really call it a storytelling RPG. Like you stop playing to tell the story, and then you go back to playing D&D kind of thing. So I feel like,
see, I would always feel like Dungeons and Dragons, and part of it's going to be how people play, right? Like I only play games theater of the mind. Like if I've got to draw something on a map, I'll do it. Like, I mean, I'll clarify things for players, but even with Dungeons and Dragons, I've never busted out miniatures. I've never gotten hyper granular. And so I think it depends a little bit on how you play it. But I'm 100% down to say actually like D&D, like granular D&D, right?
Well, so no, because the thing is, right, and this is what interests me, is like I feel like a lot of people play D&D wrong because it's better. Like people purposely ignore saying
I don't do as much granular stuff as I can.
Yes.
Like, but I feel like that is also a more common mode of D&D. And I'll be honest, I can't cite the rules right now to be like, what does D&D tell you? Like, does it tell you a certain way to play? You know, go ahead.
Because I feel like if you ever ask a question of the game, like it will answer with those things. Do you know what I mean? Like if you're like, okay, I wanna charm this character, but I'm a little bit far away from him. Can I do it? In a more story heavy D&D, like a more story heavy RPG, sorry, it might just be a bit like a sort of like, oh, okay, you know, let's say that you're doing like Blades of the Dark or something, you might get like a Devil's Gambit, or you might have to push yourself a little bit. Whereas in D&D, it's like, no, if you are 30 meters away, then you can do it. You know, it's got like a very sort of like hard answer to all the things, and I feel like whilst you can ignore those, and a lot of people do, and like I certainly will if I ever am forced to play D&D, but like there's like a there is very much like a sort of, there's the story that most people tell with the game, but then there's the story like the game is trying to tell, if that makes sense. And I think when you actually sit down and read it, there is very much like a preference to like a hard answer to all of the questions that you're supposed to have.
I'm 100% down.
If that's the kind of thing that you're looking for, then it does have that.
I put granular D&D at 4. I put story forward D&D at 7. Because I think that's probably the scale. I think it depends on how people are playing it. Like it's somewhere in that 4 to 7, because at a certain point it just becomes you're playing Dungeon, which is the D&D board game, right? And so like, which is only slightly more of a board game than like raw hyper granular D&D is anyways. And so somebody asked about Icarus. Where would you put Icarus on this? Because I own Icarus, but I've never actually played it.
Icarus is fantastic, and this is where I'm going to bring out my journalistic integrity and say that Spencer Stark is a very, very good friend of mine. He is an incredibly lovely man, but he's also a very good designer. Icarus kind of has that. It's I think a little bit further. It's probably like an 8.5. Like I think it's between Dread and Thousand Year Old Vampire, where it's mainly story heavy, but it's got this interesting like way that you play with the deck and way that you kind of assign actions rather than just doing something. You kind of like try and preempt what you're about to do, and then you've got that Jenga style thing, but it's reverse where you're building a dice tower. So yeah, I feel like Icarus sits in that kind of 8.5 spot between Dread and Thousand Year Old Vampire. I will say that I think Blades in the Dark probably sits on that 7 spot as well, to be honest.
I was going to ask that question, like where do you think Blade, because we brought it up, so it deserves to be mentioned.
So I think Blades in the Dark, like it does want you to always be sitting in the story. Like for example, there's no like, okay, now we're in combat, you know, section of the book. It's very much like whether you're fighting or chatting, you're doing the same things. But it's very much got those like mechanical like aspects to a lot of it, like the way that you fill out your crew sheet and like building new bits of turf and all that kind of stuff. I think is where it starts to get more.
Yeah, it gets that like, and actually, I'm in the playtest process for Apocalypse Keys right now, and it feels the same way. Like, there's a certain level at which some of it is mechanical. Like, how much stuff do I need to put in on the table in front of me, and how many different little bits do I have to keep track of? And it's really funny because it's a massively narrative forward game. But it definitely is a 7 on this scale, because it's like, I've got my powers of darkness, I've got my actual moves from my playbook, I've got my, like, I think most PBTA games actually, though they're highly narrative forward, they're trying to get you to that 11 side. They really are. Some of them are very mechanically focused, and then some of them are very mechanically loose. And I would say Apocalypse Keys, while being phenomenal narratively, really sits in kind of that same space, because I'm like, I would need 4 pieces of paper to track in front of me to track all the different things that I'm doing in this game. And so, like, I think looking at some of those, like, what is the table presence of some of this, absolutely, like, matters. Let's talk about this. Where would you say something like let's look at a little OSR. Where would you say something like the Black Hack sits on this? Or any of the hacks that you're familiar with?
I've not played Black Hack, and I know a lot of people talk about it, but like I have absolutely no information on that game at all.
Have you done any sort of OSR or OS? Like, have you played all the essentials?
I mean, I've played Troika. Like, I will say that like OSR is not really one of my favorite genres. Like, I prefer things that look forward rather than back, if that makes sense.
I got you.
Yeah, but I think like things like Troika, actually, for example, whilst that has like a pretty classic way of like dice rolling, like it is very sort of like high up the scale. I think like it is more on that kind of like 7 or 8 scale.
Yeah, I would put Troika at a solid 8. Like, earlier I was trying to think if I thought it was an 8 or a 9, because it's mechanically heavier than I would normally put a 9 at. But the lack of established universe and the openness for improv and storytelling definitely push it way higher up the list, which I think a lot of non-setting OSR does very well. Like, I think there's some, like, Black Hack, the reason I brought it up was like, it's about as minimalist as you can go on the OSC. Like, it's like, how do we have as few rules as possible and just focus on it's not necessarily the narrative side, but it's the player story building side of these adventures that we're going on, which are very linear, very granular, very, but there's so much freedom in just saying, like, look, there's not a solution to this problem. Like, like, we're open to however the players want to accompany or address. Holy crap, there's a giant bee that just flew into my studio.
Whoa, I can see it.
This is all real. This is all happening. I have no idea what's going on.
It's live content, baby.
I could hear the buzzing and I was like, what is that? I thought maybe it was a fly. I was not prepared for this at all. Oh my gosh, it is huge. It's a giant bumblebee, and I don't know what I'm going to do. We're going to keep on talking. So that's one of the reasons I would put it there. This is just going to be a fun I don't hear it. I think it just means it's landed somewhere. All right, we'll see if we have to deal with that more. Cool. Let's try coming at it from the other end. What are some board games that you would put in that 1, 2, or 3 spots? There's a 2 that my friend Adam from the Brain Trust put out a while ago that he actually thinks Katana's a 2, which his rationale, I think, is really solid.
Yeah, no, I get that. Yeah, it's like, it's still pretty abstract, but there is like a sense of the things that you are doing make sense both on the board game and in the world, right? So it's like, okay, I'm building a road. I'm not just putting down a piece of wood to join these 2 hexes or whatever. Like, I can see that. And I think as you go up to the 3 space, maybe that's where the theme and the mechanics are a bit more interlinked. So you might have something like, for example, like, and to be honest, I think a lot of the time, even though we've got it as kind of like 0 to 5 as board games and 6 to 11 as RPGs, I think there will be a lot of crossover. Where, I think so too. I'm thinking of something like Betrayal at the House on the Hill is probably like a 6 or a 7, so really. Yeah, because it's like, actually mechanically it's kind of light, like probably a 6 more than a 7. Like, it's mechanically kind of light. It does focus on like building a little story together and having those little like areas of like, okay, here's the new scenario that we're playing, and
right. Well, and like, I feel like games in the 4 range, like, oftentimes are like, why wasn't this a role playing game? Like, when they're coming from that board game side, they're the ones that are like, they're lore rich, right? And there's a lot of games from Skybound, I think, are this level. So James Hudson will put out a lot of these, and they create so much lore, they create so much narrative, and a lot of it's pre-written, and they're asking you to kind of travel through it. So there's not they're eliminating essentially the role playing side of things. They're like, you are a character and you're being asked to perform as that character, but you only have the mechanical choices. You don't have the narrative choices for how that works, for the most part. And that's I've played one of the games. So if anybody out there is watching, or James, if you're watching this later for some reason, because it's great content, but also, I don't know what your life is like. Then I would say, like, it's kind of devoid of that, but like Tidal Blades, which is one of those things that I think is an absolute four. It is a great game. They're making a role-playing game out because they've built so much lore in this universe. And it's like, oh crap, we've basically done all the hard work of a role-playing game. All we need is to dump it into Cypher or something and make it a game, right? And so I, like, I'll use Tidal Blades as a good example here because I
think Gloomhaven sits pretty comfortably there as well, where it's like that kind of, like you are mostly doing that kind of combat thing, but then you just sort of zoom out in between those scenarios, and you're like, okay, well, how do I actually, how does this character actually react to things? Right. And for example, you might come across a decision that you have to make where it's like, oh, actually, you can't do this if you're this character, because suddenly you're like, oh wow, my character has feelings on things. Like that's where it starts to be a bit like, oh, okay, we're telling a story here.
Right.
But for the most part, you still got that kind of like mechanical interaction. I think that 3 spot is going to be tricky to fill because I feel like a lot of games will fit in that, but it's not going to scream out at you.
I think most games fit in that spot. I think most games are going for that 3 spot, which makes sense because it's in the middle of the board game side of things, right? Mm-hmm. Like I think most RPGs are going for the 7, right? Like they're going for, we want enough mechanics around this to make people feel like they have solid control, but not too much to actually crush down the narrative. And I think that's where we see a lot of those different pieces come up. And so
I think, to be honest, for me, 3 is where Warhammer sits. Like 3.
So I was going to ask about war games specifically.
Yeah,
that was where I was
3
going.
Is where those story-heavy Warhammer games, where war games, which are just full of lore and like really thematic spells and all that kind of stuff, really sit for me. And I think you'll have certain war games that will push up to that 2 point where they're a bit more like, you think of those kind of like laying down chits on a hex map where it's very much like military tactics rather than miniatures and stuff. Oh, they're back.
So, which is funny because you guys can't always see it, but it's like so. And this mic isn't going to pick it up. It's so loud. But any board game that asks you to take on a role or a perspective, whether that's a general, whether you're like Machikuro would probably be a little bit more towards where Catan is. But like anytime you're being asked to think you are this person, I think if everyone's the same person, it's probably a 2. If you are a different person or there's some level of asymmetricality in it, I think that's when you'll start to see it push up to a 3.
I think Roots it's pretty comfortably at 3 as well, where it's like you're not just one of the armies, but you're this army and you interact with the game in this way, and you are like playing very different roles from each other. It's very asymmetric.
But it is absolutely it's still a game, even though like the RPG looks phenomenal. I'm very excited about it. But I think anything from 3 up, it's really easy to be like, we're going to take this and there's enough lore here for us to take it and make it and turn it into a full-on RPG. Anything below that, you'll be like, you're making stuff up, like you're having to design the lore and the world a whole lot more and give it some other feelings. So we've got a couple people want to know. Let's see. Electra, feel free to throw out games. I hope you don't mind me throwing out games. Lasers and Feelings doesn't have a lot of mechanics, so we're talking about 2-page RPGs like Lasers and Feelings, Honey Heist, some of those other ones. Do you have any places you'd specifically put some of those?
Yeah, I do think they're on the 8.5 of Icarus. Like Lasers and Feelings, absolutely. Because I think with RPGs, you have like the main goal is for you to tell a story and to explain what happens, right? I think the lower down you get on that list is how many things you have to interact with and able to be able to do that, right? So, for example, with Dread, it's like, I want to do the thing, okay, pull a block. And it's like a very easy question.
Right.
Whereas with improv, it just happens, right? So that's why it sits at that 10. Whereas when you get down to that 8.58 territory where you get Lasers and Feelings, suddenly it's not just pull a block or like, do one thing. Lasers and Feelings ask you to Lasers and Feelings ask you to have a choice. It's like, okay, are you going to interact in this way or in this way? And suddenly it becomes more mechanical. And you're thinking about where you sit on that number scale and stuff like that. So Lasers and Feelings, I think, is just bridging that gap between like Dread and Troika and things like that, where it's less of a case of, you've got a few stats that you pick from and you roll in different ways. You might have a special skill. It's just you are either this kind of character or this kind of character, or you sit somewhere in between them, and you're
Right.
only ever making that binary decision. Dread is just you only ever do one thing. You don't have to make a decision. You just do something. So I think on the RPG spectrum, it's kind of like how many bits of rule sit in between you and something happening in the world of the character. Whereas with board games, it's you're already interacting with those systems. Suddenly, how much of an impact are you having on the story rather than just the state of the game? So they're kind of like coming at each other in different ways and just sort of like crossing over as they hit a certain bit of arc.
Oh, Starfish Killer. So my friend MV says they imagine it's a triangle. Really, MV, tell me more about why you think it's a triangle in the chat.
Give us the 3 points. Yeah. What are the 3 points?
Yeah. Do you think there will ever be a board game version of Total War over world stuff with tactical battles? And is there something already that has that? Do you think there will be a world version?
I don't think I can talk about that because of an NDA. So
come back a year from now.
Come back in a few years.
There are some games that I know lean into some of that. Valerie says, would diplomacy fit in that category?
I think diplomacy sits with Catan, where it's like, like you said, we're all sharing the same role, and like there is like a sort of an idea of what is happening in this world as we do things.
Yeah.
But our impact on that is incredibly limited. We're just sort of like it's a wrapper, whereas I think that one spot is kind of
so I think
that one spot is when you play an abstract game and they've given it a theme and you're like, okay, I guess.
Right. And I think that's the thing. So I think one is actually like there is a theme, but it's so
disconnected it could almost not be there, right?
Right. And I'm trying to think charitably
like
of games
Hive,
that might be.
For example,
what?
Hive, the hex playing. Yeah, so it's like it's chess-like, but you are protecting your queen bee, and there's like bugs have different moves, and it's like there's a little bit more of a theme to it, but also you could just completely strip that and give them abstract pictures, and it'll still work. Like that kind of thing of you're just starting to think about what this might look like in the real world. Or you've got like a really clear image of what it looks like, but actually if you interrogate that at all, you'll find that it doesn't stand up to any questioning kind of thing.
I mean, I think a lot of traditional playing card games,
like Monopoly, for example, or like something like that.
Well, Monopoly might even be a 2, but I think traditional playing
card
1.5.
Like,
like War is you're both generals, and but I mean, it's totally a luck game, right? Like you can just there's no skill to it, but you're actually being asked to think as if you're in a battle of some sort, right? I think you have fully abstract ones like Gen. There's no narrative behind, but I think there's a lot of traditional playing card games where there is kind of some assumptive quality of what it looks like.
I think of like Flux as well. The card game of like.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, right. You're basically playing like an abstract take that game, but they've just, and you can see from the fact that it works in 8 different settings. Like there's no bridge between the mechanics and the theme. There's just like it's a wrapper around that, so you can kind of think about, it's nice because we're playing this kind of game, even though you're not really ever interacting with that in any way.
Yeah.
Whereas as you move up, like with Catan and diplomacy and risk and all that kind of thing, like when you're making decisions mechanically, like you can understand why they would make sense in the real world as well.
Yeah. So I've got, for 1, we've got theme that doesn't, but it probably doesn't matter. 2, there is a role, but it's the same. 3, clear asymmetrical roles, which could be the type of army you have, could be, you're all a character with distinctive abilities, even if they all kind of do similar things. Granular, Forest, granular DTRP, D&D, Tidal Blades, Gloomhaven, any game where you ask, they say they should have made a role-playing game out of this,
or they easily could,
which I think that's basically lots of lore, probably miniatures, actually I would just say this, lots of components that essentially make up for like theater of the mind, right? Like instead of just saying do theater of the mind, we gave you a million components. We gave you a box full of cardboard and plastic to play around with. Lots of lore, lots of components. And then we've got games in the middle that are a blend, because these are going to be different, of either modality of play, Holy crap! It's inside my light. It's fine. I don't know how it's going to get out of there, but
Electricious pointed out like Splendor and Jaipur, which I think are really good examples of a number one, where it's like
Splendor is a perfect example of a number one.
Yeah, where like what you're actually doing is picking up colored poker chips, but they've been like, okay, no, we're jewelers and we're trying to impress
Splendor, the best game I've ever played, whose theme I could care less about, right? Like,
yeah, exactly right. You could like remove the pictures of the nobles and just have like pretty gems on them, and people would be like, "Oh, there's a theme." Like
Right.
like it could very very easily pass you by. John Harper in the chat says, "The question I ask is, does the fictional stuff we're imagining affect the mechanics we're using?" Yeah, which I think is a really good way of putting it.
Yeah.
If so, it's not just a board game and crosses into RPG story game. Where yeah, like no, I completely agree. I think it's a really good way of like phrasing that in a simple sentence question of
the
Starfish. If I do something mechanically, does it affect the narrative?
Yeah, so Starfish Killer says games like Go, mechanics, games like Go, roll, pure improv theme. No idea what's here, but you don't take on a role, yet there is some sort of subjective subject explored. Yeah, I think the theme, like what's the its theme is almost a little bit meta narrative. Like, what are we asking people to talk about, or what is this game trying to do for the players? Maybe a little bit almost too. I feel like mechanics. I think for me, mechanics and theme are kind of essentials of a game, and like we talked about, like pure mechanical games don't necessarily have a theme, and I would say pure thematic games don't necessarily have mechanic, and we're just kind of using those as a role as a blend, but. Yeah, you're right. There probably is a little bit. I mean, obviously, like anything, it's going to be a more complex situation than we're just tossing out dumb ideas here around. Any other games you can think of that you feel like hit that sweet spot right in the middle? Like I know Descent will come up a lot as an entree.
The interesting thing for me was I was thinking, where does the House Doesn't Always Win sit on this metric?
Right? I was gonna ask you that question. Yeah. So I mean, like, yeah, let's talk about that.
Maybe it is kind of a 5, like because like at the root of it, I think if you found some other excuse for doing the challenges, you could just call it a card game kind of thing. But it's the fact that those those like actions you're taking with those cards are always asking questions in the world rather than just mechanically, I think is where it sits pretty comfortably in the middle, I think. And that's something that I've always been a really big fan of, like games that are very much like straddling the fence between what you might just consider a board or card game or an RPG.
And I'm trying to think, is it what's the game where it is like you're telling a classic fantasy story and you're like playing cards with words on.
Oh yeah. Once Upon a Time. Is that
Once Upon a Time? Yeah, I think Once Upon a Time is actually kind of. I think the question Once Upon a Time could be a 4, but I actually think it fits into this.
I think it's actually further up.
You think so?
I think it's a much higher number. Like I would call Once Upon a Time like as
I feel
as
like
high
the stories end up
Red,
feeling compromised because you're trying to use these cards, because there is, unlike other, there is a competitive aspect. It's
That's
not
true.
collaborative.
Yeah.
And so like that's the only reason I would put it at a 5, because it has a winner. I think the mechanics are much higher, but I think the overall effect. So I could easily go up to a 6 though, I think. On that.
Yeah, it probably does sit around that betrayal area.
What is it? Once Upon a Time.
People home see this list, by the way. Can they see our mad?
Yeah, I've got it up next to us. I mean, I don't know how legible it is to anybody on there. But it is public for people to see, and I'll drop it I'll just put it up on in the notes for this video on YouTube afterwards. So we've got. I also put. So I think there is a level at which when you're playing with things that look familiar to people, or if it looks like a board game people are more inclined to try it. So Grasping Nettles, which our friend Adam Bell created, it has this kind of central circle thing. You're writing things on index cards. It has some feelings like Microscope, but I actually think a lot of world building games like The Quiet Year, they fall into kind of this middle range also, where they might be as low as a 4, they might be as high as a 6, depending on the game. But a lot of them are things that if you put the elements in front of somebody who's used to board games and isn't used to role-playing games, they would be more inclined to try it, because they'd be like, I know what a deck of cards is. I know how to draw. I know, I know some of these other pieces. And I do think a lot of that, because this may be where parlor games actually fit, right? Like parlor games were designed to be played with very simple, resources for the most part, whether that's by passing around a bowl and writing things on paper, whether that's drawing something like Pictionary. But there is a major social mechanic to the way all of that kind of unwinds in a way that could, because like I was actually thinking about the Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, like is either a 10 or it's a 5, but I don't know which one of those it is. Because I don't know if you're familiar with the game or not, but it is like an outrage story of telling an outrageous game. So somebody says like you create a character. That character is like
yes,
either
sorry, now I'm remembering. Yeah.
either a lord or a member of the military or a member of the clergy. And there's like a rock paper scissors for how you respect each other. And then after that, you each start with a stack of chips, and you basically just drink and tell stories. And so it's like, tell me about the time you rescued the Princess of Mars from the moon colony, right, or whatever. And
it's
then
like isn't the thing where it's like, you know, you keep telling and then someone says, "Didn't this happen?"
Right, and then
you
put a
have
coin
to
in front
decide
of you,
whether
and
to
you either take
spend
that coin
or
or you don't take that coin. So there is like this wagery, push your luck. I have to take the element that you gave me into my story, or I can put a coin back and give it to you. But at the end of that, you all vote. So if I take that coin, you're not actually giving me anything other than more power when it comes to decide in who won. Like you're not actually giving me the ability to win more easily. You're giving me the ability to decide if you won more easily. And so like there's this very interesting like social quality to the game that I think is incredibly satisfying, but it is just free form storytelling. And so, that's because I didn't hit transition. Sorry. Somebody said they couldn't see it. There we go. Here's all the stuff I've been typing up. There we go. It's a day. So anyways, like I said, it either is a parlor game, right, which I think would sit more closely to the middle, or it's like a 10, because again, other than you tell stories and then at the end everybody moves their coins in front of whoever think they did the best job, like that's just the voting aspect. It's either like I can give you more power in the voting pool by interjecting things into your story or forcing you to reject them, right? Which might throw you off your game, like, and therefore make you tell a worse story. But it's kind of that kind of wagering quality. And then the theory is that whoever wins just buys the next round of drinks and you play again, right?
For me, it feels like a 9, I think. Like it's got that same level of dread where it's just like they try to have as little things in between you and the story, right? Where it's like, you know, there is just one thing there just to keep it ticking along. But apart from that, you're just there to have a good time and say silly things, right? Whereas like I feel like Dread's a good comparison to that, where it's like, you know, you feel like your little questionnaire, which is basically just to help you make a character, and then you just go through the world and do a thing until you have to pull something or in this case push a coin or pull it, right? It's like it's got that you're trying to spell Munchausen.
no idea. Barely spelled Baron correctly. And so so let's real quick kind of cruise through, because we're getting near the end of our time together, which has been a blast.
Well, I know we had a big chunk where it was cutting out. Like I can stay for as long as you want. If you want me longer, I'll stay
downstairs,
longer.
which makes me wonder if she's trying to get my attention or if because she doesn't want to come down in the basement. There's a bee down here. It's huge and horrible. Did you need me? I'll just be a little bit longer. All right. I just wanted to say we can go a little bit longer. I just wanted to make sure that we hit kind of what we feel about some of the, like, I think 1 through 5 we kind of nailed a little bit pretty well about what kind of defines them in our mind. Let's look at kind of that 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I would say 10 is basically barely a rule, right? Like there is like the rules for improv are yes and. The Herald has a format for how you narratively tell the stories, but part of learning like the format of any improv game is to learn when to use it and then when to push back against it, right?
It's almost less of a rule and more of like a social code. Like, you know, it's like a code of, it's like a codified version of communication, right?
Yeah, I like codified communication and social dynamics. Interaction. Like that. And then, okay, so what do we said for like Dread, Extraordinary Adventures, there's only one thing, right? There's
one thing stopping you from doing what you want to do.
One thing that manipulate. And it's not even a does it happen? It's a
what happens.
It happens, right? Yeah. Like, yeah, that's the thing. So there's
There's basically like there a single element that is out of the player's control, essentially, to a degree.
Always happens. Okay, 1,000-year-old vampire, Icarus, Troika, lasers and feeling. This I feel like is kind of like in that 3-1. Originally, it's kind of hard to define. I think it's kind of like these are narrative forward, right? Like,
yeah, I was going to say narrative forward with like, mechanics that are there to help rather than hinder, if that makes sense.
Mechanics to and like some of the interesting things are about that. I don't know about Icarus because, like I said, I own it, but I haven't played it. But for Troikas and Lasers and Feelings and some of the other games in this, there is a more communal quality to the narrative of the story. Like, you're less dependent on the DM, or a decision maker. Even with 1,000-year-old vampire, right? Like, it's only you, but still, there is a more of a communal conversation, and that doesn't mean that all GM-less games would fall into this. But I think we'd see a lot of lighter PBTA falls into this, whereas like heavier PBTAs would be a 7. But mechanics keep everyone on the same page.
So I think when we get to a 7, this is where the game tells as much a story as the players, right? I think this is where the game has its own narrative it's pushing as at the same time as yours, which you can see from things like Blades in the Dark, where it's like, there is a way in which this world works, and it will do things to you as much as you do things to it. And you can ask the game a question, not just the GM or yourself.
Okay. So the game design tells us as much about play as the players and GM do. I like that. Betrayal of the House of Haunted on the House of Haunted Hill. So 6s are you're playing a role. So what is a 6? It's leaning towards story.
So I think 6 is where the game is telling a story and you can influence it, rather than you're telling a story and the game can influence it. Right? Where it's like the power shifts from you to the mechanics, sort of thing.
I like that.
I think this makes sense.
That's what we wrote down. I think it's fun to pop out and see what other people are going to say. Also, too, let people kind of pop in. I'll pop it up if you're a brain trustee. I'll pop it up as in the brain trust later. Which I don't know. Wheels, I don't know if you're a member of. I'll shoot you a link to that. Also,
do you know what? I've heard a lot of people talk about it. I still don't know what it is. So I'm assuming it's a Discord or something.
It's a secret cabal. Yeah, it's a Discord community with a lot of great designers in it. I'll pop you a link later on. Like I said, this was when you were like, yeah, we can take a little bit more time. I was like, well, here's a thing I'm excited about that I also heard you talk a little bit about, that I think would just be fun to just start being able to talk about. Look, as we talk about, like, because people are like, I don't like board games, or I don't know that anybody says I don't like board games. People may say I don't like play a lot of board games. I play role-playing games. Lots of people who are board game players don't play role-playing games. And for me, this started as just what are the 10 games you play, to take somebody from I'm a board game player to I could play an RPG and be comfortable, right? And some people are going to hit different points on this and be like, that's it, I'm out. Like, I don't want to do improv, but I think most people could actually make it to 9 on this scale without getting super uncomfortable. In the same way that I think a lot of role players could go down to 2 and still be satisfied by the game experience. Like, Diplomacy is incredibly satisfying because it's got a rich social mechanic, but while still being a very crunchy tabletop, like, board game war game. But like, I can absolutely have a blast getting into playing as Germany or whatever other game. Diplomacy probably is like a 2.5 because you do also start out with this kind of disseparate starting position that's meant to be balanced, but it is a little asymmetrical. No, but I like this. I like this. We'll kick it out to a couple people, and then maybe we'll put it into a PDF and let people download it from wherever they want to. But no, I had an absolute blast. Tell people again where they can find you online if they're looking to connect.
Yeah, so I am on Twitter at Whelan, spelled with a K, so it's KUBEWHELAN. It's not very easy to find. I'm sorry. You can also just search Wheels. You might find me that way. Dicebreaker Wheels on Google will usually find me on most places. Most of my game stuff is on wheelsrpgs.com, which is very easy to spell. So you can find stuff about the House Always Win on there, as well as the other 2 games that I've released. It's also the place where you'll be able to download modules and things like that if you're looking for more content for it. And there's also loads of information about members of the house. So if you want to make your own game based on the mechanics in the House Always Win, there's a space for you to do that there. Another just quick shout out, I mentioned it briefly, but just in case it got lost, if you're from a marginalized background, or you just don't have the money to buy the game to look at the mechanics, but you're interested in them and you want to make something with it, give me an email. I can send you a free copy. Like I'm much more interested in seeing people make things with the mechanics that I've put out than anything else. Like it's never been a game I've been trying to get rich off of or anything like that. Right. I don't think anyone in the TTRPG space is trying to get rich. So give me a shout about that. And if you want to make a member of the house game, like, you just need my permission. So just give me an email and I'll let you put that logo on there. Yeah. And hopefully give you a shout out on some of my socials as well. You can also find me on dicebreaker.com and youtube.com/dicebreaker, where we do all kinds of stuff like this, talking shop and reviewing things and playing things and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in board games, you're interested in TTRPGs, or if you just want to see my big stupid face tell dumb jokes and lose at things, then you go on over to Dicebreaker and you'll find plenty of that. But yeah, thank you very much for having me, Tony.
Yeah, it was a blast to have you on. Just a reminder, everybody, we've got Troika Fest coming up next week. It's actually Troika Fest Jam started today. If you've never played Troika before, if you're like, I want to play Troika for the first time, if people talk about Troika but you don't know what it is, this is absolutely an event for you. We would love to see you come out and play for the first time. We've got open games we'll be organizing via Discord. You also don't have to participate with anything we're doing to be part of Troika Fest. Troika Fest is a totally decentralized online event with just support from us and Melsonian Arts Council to encourage people to try Troika for the first time. If you are somebody who wants to dip your toes into game design, you can get a Troika Fest Jam. So it started today, and there's already like 16 or 17 projects that are up on it, because people sometimes are just really excited, other times get confused by when things launch or just wanted to have it ready. But it's going all month long, and you can go check that out and dip your toe into game design for the first time ever. There's a third-party license for that, but we'll also have a bunch of streams next week. We're doing a lot of giveaways also too, included in which we have our Backer Quest series, which that graphic is totally jacked up right now because it got lost in the stream thing, which is where we review new games that are coming up or out every other week at 3 p.m. on Wednesdays. That's going to come up next week. So if you've got a new project that's launched on itch, on Kickstarter, anything else like that, let us know. We would love to cover it. We just look at about 10 games, pop those out to the world and talk about what our thoughts are about them, just try to signal boost great content. Even if it's just something that's come out in your own web store, please let us know about that when they come up. Our hope here is to help great players find designers that they can love, and help designers find great players who love their games. My name is Tony Vicinda. You can find me at Tony Vicinda on social media. You can find +1EXP at +1EXP.com, or you can go to at +1EXP on those same social media platforms to find us also. If you... I don't know what I was going to say. We're a weird little brand that multi-classes in tabletop game design, beard and skincare alchemy, and the Bardic College of Content Creation. This has been Prestige Class with Michael Whelan. And until next time, class is dismissed. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks.